Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I am going to read S4 4091 Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Chapter 1 The Ball. The carriage was waiting. The night was warm. The Bennet sisters, Jane, Lizzie, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, were dressed in their finest ball gowns. Flowers and ribbons threaded through their hair. Hurry, hurry, cried their mother, urging them out of the house. Kitty, do stop coughing. Oh, Jane, how beautiful you look. I'm so glad. It's so important you look your best tonight. But why is that? Why is that? Asked her husband, Mr. Bennet, reluctantly, leaving his study, a book still clasped in his hand. How can you be so tiresome? Retorted Mrs. Bennet, as they climbed into the carriage. You must know what I meant. This boat is the first chance to meet Mr. Bingley. He has just moved to Netherfield Park. He's young and single and rich. Such a man must be in want of a wife. Perhaps he will choose you, my dear, said Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet laughed foolishly. I was certainly pretty in my time, but now I only think of my daughters. If I could have one settled at Littlefield and all the others well married, I'd have nothing to wish for. I can't think he will want to dance with anyone, replied Mr. Bennet. They are all very silly girls, though Lizzie is slightly less silly than the rest of them. How can you say that about your own children? Cried Mrs. Bennet. Ooh, you enjoy teasing me. You never think of my poor nerves. On the contrary, I know them well. They are my oldest friends. You have talked about them for 20 years. Mrs. Bennet was about to protest when the carriage came to a halt. They had arrived at the ball. A music wafted out on the night air, and inside, the ballroom was alive with excitement and chatter. Candles flickered in their holders. Girls in white dresses danced with soldiers in scarlet coats. Then the doors opened to reveal a new arrival, Mr. Bingley of Netherfield Hall. He is so rich, the brilliant Mrs. Bennet, and so handsome. Look at his sisters, such elegant dresses. But have you heard, cried her friend, Mrs. Lucas. Mr. Bingley has brought his friend, Mr. Darcy, owner of a Pemberley house. He is even richer. You talk of riches, said Mary, gravely, but in virtue is more important. Lydia had already left the group. Come on, Kitty, she cried. Let's go and flirt with the officer. Mr. Bingley's sisters look very proud and haughty, said Lizzie. Observing them, they are not talking to anyone, Jane agreed. But perhaps they are just shy. Oh, Jane, that's so like you to think the best of everyone. What about Mr. Bingley? Do you think him handsome? Oh, yes, sighed Jane, her eyes glowing. A moment later, Mr. Bingley came up to them. He smiled at Jane. She smiled back. He asked her to dance. From across the room, Mrs. Bennet looked on with a great satisfaction. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, danced once with Jane, spent the rest of the evening walking around the room with his nose in the air and his mouth turned down in a sneer. Come on, Darcy, said Mr. Bingley, leaving Jane's side for a moment. I hate to see you standing by yourself in this stupid manner. Why don't you dance? Lizzie was at that moment without a dance partner. I was sitting on a bench at the side of the room, where she could overhear every word of Mr. Darcy's reply. You know, I detest dancing unless I know my partner particularly well. Besides, you're dancing with the only beautiful girl in the room. She is beautiful, you're right, but her sister is very pretty. Let me introduce you. Mr. Darcy glanced at Lizzie. Catching her eye, he instantly withdrew his own. "Oh, she's passable, I suppose, but not pretty enough to tempt me," he said curtly. "I will not dance with a girl who's been rejected by other gentlemen." Lizzie got up and walked away, allowing herself the pleasure of just one remark, which she made with her most enchanting smile. "Sir, you're all that polite." Leaving him swiftly, she went in search of her friend, Charlotte Lucas, and eased her feelings by making a funny story of it. Poor Lizzie, comforted Charlotte. "To be only just passable, he has an excuse for being proud, perhaps. He has looks, an important family, and fortune." "Nonsense!" snorted Mrs. Bennet, overhearing their conversation. "I saw it all, and I think he's a most disagreeable man. Another time, Lizzie, I wouldn't dance with him, even if he does ask you. I believe I can safely promise never to dance with Mr. Darcy," said Lizzie, as Lizzie enjoyed watching those around her. She did not suspect that she was being watched, and by Mr. Darcy, having first dismissed her. Darcy was now struck by her lovely dark eyes, her liveliness and wit. "Well, Mr. Darcy," whispered the Bingley's sister, Caroline, in his ear, "have you, like me, had enough? The noise is so vulgar. Jane Bennet is a sweet girl, but her family are really not our class, and the uncle is a shopkeeper. How low can you sink? You're quiet. What are you thinking of?" "I'm thinking what a fine pair of eyes I can see." Miss Bingley at once fixed her gaze on his face. "Who do those eyes belong to?" she murmured softly. His answer silenced her. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." Chapter 2. Love Lost. Whenever the Bennets and Mr. Bingley now met, Mr. Bingley always sought out Jane. Lizzie could see that Jane was on her way to falling deeply in with him. She was surprised to find that Mr. Darcy always seemed to be watching her. "I can't think why," she told her friend Charlotte, "unless he means to criticize me, for he never comes near me, but I like him too little to mind what he thinks of me." Instead, her attention was caught by a new officer in town, Mr. Wickham. Lydia was the first to meet him. "Everyone is in love with him," she declared. "He's so handsome, so handsome. If you come into town with me, I'll introduce you." As soon as Lydia saw Wickham, she rushed over and dragged him back to meet her sisters. Looking very pleased with herself, Lizzie was immediately struck by his charm. His manners were so easy and engaging. After Mr. Darcy's cold formality, they fell behind the others and walked a little way together. "Lydia says you often meet with the party at Netherfield," the Wickham observed. "Do you know Mr. Darcy well?" "As much as I ever wished to," said Lizzie. "I have known him since I was a child. His father was the best of men, very fond of me. When he died, he left me a job as a clothesman. But when the position came up, Mr. Darcy refused to give it to me." Lizzie gasped. "This is shocking. I thought him to be a proud, disagreeable man, but not as bad as this." "I think he must have been jealous of me," said Wickham. "But the memory of his father means I wouldn't wish to tell people and see Darcy disgraced in public." Lizzie thought how good it was of Wickham to say so, and thought him all the handsomer as he said it. When they parted company, her head was full of him. She could think of nothing but Mr. Wickham and what he had told her. At home, Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain her excitement. "Mr. Bingley is holding a ball," she told them. As for Jane, I'm sure of it. Lizzie planned to spend the evening dancing with Mr. Wickham, but when they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. "I see how it is," she thought. "Mr. Darcy has made sure he isn't invited. She turned and found herself suddenly in front of Mr. Darcy. He asked her for the next dance and took her so much by surprise that she agreed without knowing what she did. They began the dance without speaking a word. As the silence went on, Lizzie began to suspect it would last the entire dance and was happy to keep it until she imagined it might be a greater punishment for Mr. Darcy to talk. We must say something to each other, she began. It'll look very odd otherwise. If I talk about the dance, you ought to make some remark about the size of the room. He smiled, but said nothing. At first, unable to stop herself, she said, I recently met someone who knows you, Mr. George Wickham, who has just come to town. The effect of his name was immediate. Mr. Darcy blushed and looked more haughty than ever. Finally, he said in a strained way, Mr. Wickham has such happy manners. He makes friends wherever he goes. Whether or not he can keep them is another matter. He has been so lucky as to lose your friendship, Lizzie remarked. He has. In my good opinion, once lost is lost forever. I suppose you're very careful when you decide against someone. I am. The dance ended and they parted company, each feeling dissatisfied. For Lizzie, the evening only got worse. She had to watch Lydia and Kitty flirting openly with the officers. Mary was playing the piano very badly and was refusing to stop. Worst of all was her mother, telling everyone as loudly as she could how she would soon have a daughter at Netherfield. Lizzie saw Mr. Darcy watching her family with disdain and wished him 1,000 miles away. The next morning, a letter arrived from Netherfield for Jane. She turned pale as she read it and quickly left the room. What is it, Jane? Asked Lizzie, following her to the bedroom. It's from Caroline Bingley, replied Jane in a quick, quiet voice, her hand shaking slightly, and she passed Lizzie the letter. My dear friend, we have left for London, and I doubt we shall ever return to Netherfield. We are going to be spending much of our time with Mr. Darcy and his delightful sister, Georgiana. She and my brother have always been close, and I hope soon that Miss Darcy and I shall be sisters. Oh, this shows, said Lizzie. Is that Miss Bingley means her brother never to come back? Jane smiled slightly, but shook her head. She makes it very clear that she doesn't want her brother to marry me. She means him to marry Darcy's sister. Of course he'll come back, Jane, said Lizzie. I never saw a man more deeply in love than Bingley was with you. But as the leaves turned and the trail of winter crept into the house, Bingley still didn't return. It pained Lizzie to see Jane's strained face. The sadness in her smile. To make matters worse, the mother wondered daily when Bingley would come back. I tried to forget him, Jane told Lizzie, and not to think of him. But it's so hard when mother speaks of him all the time. But I will forget him, she went on, and be calm and contented as before. Lizzie couldn't bear it for Jane any longer. She wrote to the Gardners, her aunt and uncle in London, asking them to invite Jane to stay. They were the relatives she and Jane felt closest to. She could only hope that a change of scene would help Jane forget Mr. Bingley. Chapter 3. A Proposal. Home without Jane wasn't the same. Lizzie saw Wickham often, but he now spent most of his time with the rich young heiress Mary King. Now that Darcy had left, it became known everywhere what he had done to Wickham. Everybody spoke of the affection for Wickham and the dislike of Mr. Darcy. Then another letter came, this time from her friend Charlotte Lucas, who had recently married, inviting her to come and stay. Lizzie accepted with joy. Charlotte's husband, Mr. Collins, was the vicar in Kent, living on the estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whom he seemed to worship. He talked of nothing but Lady Catherine from morning until night. Her ladyship is wonderfully kind to us, Mr. Collins told her. You're particularly lucky, Elizabeth, for she has invited us all to dine with her tomorrow. Lizzie looked over, caught her friend's eye, and had to try very hard not to laugh. I look forward to it, Mr. Collins, she said. The more Lizzie saw of Mr. Collins, more she wondered why her friend had married him. He was a vain, pompous man. I see you are surprised by my choice of husband, said Charlotte. Even though Lizzie had tried to hide it. But I was never romantic, you know. I've only ever wanted a comfortable home. I'm not pretty like you, and would much rather have Mr. Collins than no one. Lizzie said nothing. She felt deeply that she could never marry without love. For the rest of the day and the following morning, all Mr. Collins could talk of was their forthcoming dinner. As the weather was fine, they walked to Lady Catherine's grand house across the park. Servants ushered them into the drawing room, and Lizzie gasped, standing at the window, looking as proud as ever, was Mr. Darcy. She thought. He started a little when he saw her. I have my nephews staying with me, said Lady Catherine heartily. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Fitzwilliam. We have met before, said Mr. Darcy briefly, bowing at Lizzie, but making no effort to come over and talk to her. Mr. Fitzwilliam, however, seemed delighted with Lizzie, and after dinner he drew her over to the piano, asking her to play as he turned the music. You're trying to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, said Lizzie, as he came over to watch her. I know you have high standards. I can't believe you mean what you say, replied Darcy. Of course I have no wish to alarm you, do you know, Liz went on, addressing herself to Mr. Fitzwilliam. I could tell you some very shocking things about Mr. Darcy. And what are those? Asked Darcy. The first time I met him at a ball, he did not dance once, even though there was more than one lady in want of a partner. Perhaps, said Mr. Darcy, I should have asked, but I'm not at ease with a stranger. That's because you don't make the effort. I'm not talented at playing the piano, but I have always supposed that to be my fault for not trying harder. Darcy smiled. You're right. You have used the term better than me. What are you talking of? Interrupted Lady Catherine. Ending the discussion, come over here where I can hear you. The next morning, Lizzie was sitting by herself, writing to Jane, when to her great surprise, Mr. Darcy came in. He seemed just as astonished at finding her alone. They sat down, but after a few questions on either side sank into silence. He didn't stay long, but Charlotte couldn't believe he had come at all. He must be in love with you, Lizzie, she said, but when Lizzie told her of his silence, she admitted it didn't seem possible. Soon after Darcy's visit, Lizzie met Mr. Fitzwilliam on one of her walks in the countryside. He stopped when he saw her and began walking along beside her. You're leaving soon? Lizzie asked. Yes, Mr. Fitzwilliam replied. If Darcy doesn't put it off again, and you must wait on him, said Lizzie. It seems like he likes to have his own way. But so do we all, and he's very good to his friends. Only this summer he saved his friend Bingley from a narrow escape. What do you mean? Asked Lizzie. Only that I heard Bingley was going to marry a very unsuitable girl, and that Darcy managed to stop him. Lizzie walked on, her heart swelling, unable to say anything. She got away as soon as she could and went straight to her room. So Darcy was the cause of all Jane's unhappiness, she thought. He was the reason Mr. Bingley had gone so suddenly. He had ruined every hope of happiness for her sister. The others left for tea with Lady Catherine, but Lizzie couldn't go, claiming instead that she felt unwell. She stayed in her room, rereading Jane's letter, her anger growing as she was reminded of Jane's unhappiness. The doorbell rang, and she went down to see who was calling. To her great amazement, Mr. Darcy was shown in. Hurriedly, she asked how she felt. Then, without a word, began pacing up and down. Suddenly he turned and spoke to her. I've struggled, but it will not do. You must allow me to tell you how much I love and adore you. Liz was too astonished to speak. Mr. Darcy seemed to take her silence as encouragement. You're poor, he said. Your family is nothing to mine. But I have tried not to love you and found it impossible. Will you marry me? Lizzie tried to compose herself, but felt anger rise within her. I cannot marry you, she said. I'm sorry if this gives you pain, but I'm sure it won't last. Mr. Darcy struggled, paused, and then spoke in a voice of forced calmness. And this is a reply. This is all I deserve. Had you asked me in a more gentlemanlike way, I might have been more polite in my refusal, but I could never marry the man who's been so cruel to my sister. Can you deny that you separated Bingley from Jane? Though your treatment of Wickham alone is enough to make me despise you, I'm not ashamed of my actions, said Mr. Darcy. And as for my proposal, can you expect me to be glad that you come from such a family? Lizzie felt herself growing more angry every moment. You could not have asked me to marry you in any possible way that would have made me accept you, she said in a shaking voice. From the moment I met you, I knew you were the last man in the world whom I would ever marry. And almost from the first I loved you. You have said quite enough. I perfectly understand your feeling. Forgive me for taking up your time. With these words, he hurriedly left the room. Lizzie felt weak, astonished that Mr. Darcy should be in love with her, and for so long that he wanted to marry her, in spite of all the objection. But his pride, what he had done to Jane, to Wickham, that Lizzie heard the sound of a carriage. She knew the others were returning and fled back to her room. Oh, the end. Part 1, the end.